Today we are going to introduce Diane Wagner, and she has been with the Learning Disabilities Association of Ontario, which is the LDAO, since 1987. In her position as
very old.
In her position as manager of public policy, client services, and training, Diane communicates with parents, individuals with learning disabilities, professionals, educators, employers, and students around the province. She provides training and support to LDAO chapters and LDAO representatives of the Special Education Advisory Committees, SEACs, at the school boards. Through her work with the LDAO, legislation and policy, the Legislation and Policy Committee, Diane prepares public policy and responses on numerous issues that affect children, youth, and adults with learning disabilities. So, we'd like to give a warm welcome to Diane Wagner. We'll take it from here. Thanks.
Thank you. And as I mentioned, some of you who are at the back, if you have trouble hearing me, please raise your hand because we don't have a microphone here. So I will try to keep my voice up. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is I'm going to go through part of what I want to say about talking at the first part about the special education formal identification system. And I'm going to stop for a break for questions, and then go on to talk about the IEP, Individual Education Plan, which is really what I like to say, that's where the rubber hits the road in terms of what actually happens. So then I'll go on to that and have more question time at the end. And if you have a burning question, that's okay as we go along, but I will be allowing time partway through for questions. So, and I'm going to start with our approach to advocacy. So one of the things, and you'll see it at the back, is we ourselves at Integra Children's Mental Health Center created a parent advocacy program called Partnering with Schools for Student Success. So our point of view, our approach to advocacy is partnership, and I think People for Education is a similar kind of point of view. But in being an effective advocate as a partner in the school system, there's some things that are helpful. So keeping a record of all communications, that means including phone calls, everything. Writing everything down and keeping that, because then you can refer back and you don't have to count on your memory. We do say attending and participating fully in all school meetings, with the idea that that's not always possible with working parents and schedules. As much as possible to be there when things are being discussed is really helpful. Not just sitting back and letting the educators talk to you, but asking questions and feeling empowered to ask questions when you're not really sure what they're saying, or asking for clarification. Could you please say that in other words? Something like that. The next one is a really important one, being persistent without being a pest. And sometimes there's a real fine line there, because asking once and assuming things are going to work out doesn't always work. It's kind of how you do it. And if you do it in a positive way, but ask again, that can be really important. And we'll come back to some of these at the end after we talk about what you're advocating about. And I want to have more of a discussion. Okay, so monitoring to make sure that plans are implemented, that sort of goes along with being persistent. Quite often, because I talk to a lot of parents who are by email around Ontario, And often I'll hear a parent who will say, you know, I thought everything was going okay. And, you know, we made some plans and I assumed that everything was going fine. And unfortunately, you can't assume. Although everybody means well, things don't always go the way they're supposed to. So checking in and making sure that things are happening is really important. Finding allies is really important. So finding people in the school who really get it. And that's how I use the phrase. It may be the resource teacher, it may be the actual teacher, in high school it may be a guidance counselor, or it may be, in some cases, say the special education, the psychologist who did the assessment, somebody who really you see as an ally is helpful. Thanking people who have helped, that's not just your allies, that's everybody. Because people are more likely to be helpful if they're thanked for being helpful. The next one is hard. Accepting that if you're going to be effective, you're not always going to be popular. And one of the things that we have sort of a self-reflection section in our advocacy training program. And one of the things that people say as they're reflecting on their advocacy style is sometimes they have too much of a tendency to not stir the waters because they're afraid they're not going to be liked. And we all are like that, so that's a hard one. And then involving your child as much and as early in the process as appropriate. And that can be quite young, certainly in terms of talking to your child about what's going on and answering the questions. But going to meetings as they get a little bit older, IPRC, certainly IEP meetings can be helpful. And part of all the things we were talking about earlier, if you actually keep a profile, if you actually keep a file with all of these kinds of things on it, and probably you would have most of those things. The communications log, again, I talked about keeping all the communications, a record of all those communications, and this is where you keep it. And current and past IEPs, it's important to have, if your child has an IEP, it's important to have all of those and keep them together. Because in some, especially when they have electronic IEPs in schools, they don't necessarily have the old ones prepared. So, or if you're changing schools, it's really good to see that progress through the IEPs. Okay, so what is special education? This is the actual wording that the ministry used. So special education programs and services are instruction and assessment that are different. So the idea is that it's different than what the regular student population gets. And I'm going to talk more about accommodations and modifications later. But the main focus of special education, I would say, these days with the ministry is helping students access the curriculum and be able to meet curriculum expectations, whether they're modified or not. And for those of you who are not familiar with legislation, it's Regulation 181, which took place in 1998. That is the most important one to do with special education. And you can get a summary of that on the Ministry of Education's website, or you could probably Google it and it would come up. Okay, so the IPRC. How many people have been through an IPRC process? Okay, so you're pretty familiar with that. And the term exceptional is one that's really used here and not anywhere else that I know of. But exceptional basically means that you're entitled to services. And it entitles you to services. So The important thing is that an IPRC is not the only method that you can get special education services, but it's the only thing that legally entitles you to. So the school may create an IP, but they don't have to create an IP. So it's the only thing that you can appeal. So a lot of times, schools may say, well, it's not really important. It's more paperwork.
Yeah.
And it's more meetings. So, and the ministry in the last several years has really been saying that they don't really, sports don't necessarily have to have an IPRC. If the child, especially if the child is going to stay in the regular class, they really encourage school boards to have an IPRC if the child is going to be in a self-contained class for part of the day, but not necessarily. But all the messaging says that parents maintain the right to have an IPRC. Now, parents need to know they have that right. You can't exercise your rights if you don't know you have the rights. So the flaw in the process, as far as we're concerned, is that you have to know that you can ask for that. And if nobody tells you, then that can be a problem.
And how you need to ask in order to make them provide it.
Yes.
Right, and that you need to ask in writing. And you have to, and if you don't put it in writing, then it might work, but it's legally written that you have to put the request in writing.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what the flaw in the system.
The flaw in the system is that you have to know that you can ask, because if you don't know what the process is, if you don't know there's a formal process for identification, if the school says, fine, we'll look after it, we'll make sure your child gets what they need. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen. It can happen. It may happen. But there's no obligation on the school to let you know that there is an IPRC process. The school boards all have to have a parent guide, but you kind of have to know to ask for the parent guide.
It's available upon request.
Yeah, and again, there are principals out there that are very good at giving out parent guides and encourage it. And it's across the province. There's a lot of variation in that. But, yeah.
What's a parent guide?
Good point. Exactly right. Okay, so every school board has to have their own parent guide that explains their process, which is, and the legal process is the same around the whole province. Exactly how they do it in that school board varies a little bit. What the options are for different placements varies. And some school boards have different levels of IPRCs too, and I believe Toronto is one of them, especially bigger boards probably. You have the school level IPRC, and then you have the board level IPRC if you're going to be looking at going to a placement outside the school. Some school boards, it's all one level of IPRC. So that kind of thing would be explained in the parent guide, and that should be available to all at all schools. It is also on their website if you can find it.
That's probably what their answer would be to you if you ask for it.
But to
That it's on the website.
Well, if you ask for it, they're legally obligated to give it to you.
But on the website, then ask them to show you on their computer how to get it.
Oh, okay.
Because sometimes it's hard to, things get weird, and it's not that people are trying to hide it, it's just hard to find things, yeah.
What does a parent do if the parent will identify at an IPRC in grade 8 as having an LD, but grade 9 teachers felt that they didn't see that, and
Well, an IPRC, if you're in the same board, doesn't go away. You see, I mean, IPRC, the only way that you can be unidentified is to have a meeting and decide that.
Yeah.
They can't just decide that you don't need help anymore. They can try to convince you, but they can't just decide that formally. And I'll get to it in a minute, but I just wanted to say here that if you're waiting for an IPRC meeting, it actually says in the regulation that they have to provide the services based on what they know already.
So that may be the implication that you they may not provide the services that's needed if the child is not fully identified.
Right.
Yes,
Is there a risk the parent run if she doesn't insist that it carries on?
Yes.
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 Thank you.
Yeah, so, yeah, no, once you're identified, it goes into high school, and there will be a review IPRC meeting, so that, and if there isn't, then you should be asking why there isn't.
You mentioned about the same, once it's in the same school board. Are you saying that if it's happened,
If you change boards?
If there's a change in the board, it does not have to carry on?
Then you would go and need to have an IPRC in that board. Okay, you would take all the information with you, all the OSR in that. Hopefully, things will proceed in a similar way, but as I say, each board does things a little bit differently, so it might
But
not be
the
quite the same.
OSR would have the information because it's being transferred.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks.
Yes.
So I just want, because we're on this line, I was going to save my question for later, but I have a personal issue with that because my son was identified as an IPRC for many years. In June, of course we do it in the spring, end of the year, changed schools the following September and was told the IPRC does not transfer, like the child did not miraculously become no longer required to have an IPRC. And as well, his special needs required for special computers, etc. And that also remained in the previous school, which was provided for by the Ministry of Education for this child, not for the school, for this child.
Right, and,
So-
and again, those are all the kinds of things that there are policies on, but they don't always get followed. I do want to say, and I'm not referring to you in specific, but if there are specific situations, I would be happy to talk to you about them afterwards. I can't get into a lot of detail about individual situations because then I need to ask questions and stuff. But that's,
Well, further questions.
yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so again, in the process, sometimes there's a pre-IPRC, there's a case conference, sometimes, or a school support team you'll hear. This is usually in the earlier grades, and school boards have their own policies. You have to be invited to an IPRC. You don't have to be invited by law to these meetings. And usually with a younger child, unless they're coming in with identification, they're going to want to try a few things to see if providing a little extra support is all the child needs. And that's fine as long as if it's not working, then you go to the next step. Okay, so again, this is what you were saying, it has to be in writing. You are entitled to be president and participate in all discussions. I've been hearing lately from other parent representatives that sometimes school boards have asked parents to leave while they discuss things. No. That used to happen, but the regulation says no, you have the right to be there for all discussions. You can take somebody with you for moral support. You should let them know that you're bringing somebody. They have to consider any information you submit. Consider does not mean accept, but they have to consider it. Okay, so the written statement of decision, sometimes you'll get that at the meeting, sometimes you'll get it afterwards. I'm probably going to say it later, but don't sign it at the meeting. We always advise people to think about it first and have a chance to reflect on it. So the description of strengths and needs is on the statement. First of all, whether your child is exceptional, the original one. And then their strengths and needs, and those strengths and needs go to the IEP. So that's really important that they have good strengths and needs and a good understanding of your child. The categories and definitions of exceptionality. So it used to be that kids could just be identified as exceptional somehow. And nowadays, since Regulation 181, they have to give a category and definition. So, for example, learning disabilities comes under communication as the category, and learning disabilities is the definition. Autism spectrum disorder comes under communication as well. Intellectual category has both gifted and intellectual disabilities. So they have to make a decision about that at the IPRC. They have to decide placement. And placement can range anywhere from regular class with support to a self-contained class, which is at least 50% or 51% of the day, if your board has that. Yes?
Can they do this without a psychometrist going through and testing the child? Because at that point, you've already signed permissions for everything. So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, so there can be...
It's difficult. The problem is because they have to have the definition.
Diagnosis, right.
Yeah, well, they don't have to have a diagnosis.
No.
They don't have, they do have to have an assessment usually in order to decide what exceptionality definition. So in some cases, they will put off having an IPRC or making a decision until they have that assessment results.
Now, does this fall into the new ADHD? That kind of...
Okay. So say a child had ADHD and they had an assessment report that said they had difficulties in executive functioning and working memory and all those things, and those interfered with learning, then they can be identified under learning disability. That's what there was a memo that went out in December of 2011, I think, that said that.
Is it okay that a child is out like 75% of the class? Like he's out of the class?
That would be a self-contained placement. It wouldn't be
But
regular
it's
class.
okay that it's like he's in the classroom for 20 minutes of the day, that's it. And then like Halloween, he was there for the day with his class. But other than
You
that,
mean outside of school?
no, he's at school, but he's not with his peers more than 20 minutes a day.
Well, that's an individual decision, and that's something that if you didn't agree with, then you'd want to have a question about placement decision, because it's really important that you understand what the placement decision means and that you agree with it, okay? And there's processes if you don't agree with it. One of the things that I often hear is, what is the placement decision? Well, it's regular class with support. What does that mean? Not much, quite frankly. Or it can, but it doesn't necessarily mean that much. Regular class with withdrawal at least gives you the idea that the child will go out and have some time with a special ed teacher. At least that's what it's supposed to mean. So I really question when people say that regular class with support is the placement decision, because again, it's like an informal IEP. It gives you nothing. It gives you, with goodwill and following through, it may work, but it doesn't really give you anything on paper. So the other thing that's important to note is that recommendations can be made about special education programs and services, but not decisions. So those recommendations are important, but you can't appeal them because they're not decisions. The decisions are the categories and definitions of the placement. So these are the things that you can do if you don't agree. And I do urge people, if they are not happy, to request a second meeting. Maybe bring somebody with you in the second meeting if you didn't have somebody in the first meeting. Because if they know that you're really serious about not being happy with the decisions, then having a second chance to talk about it can be helpful. Rather than saying, oh, I'm going to appeal it. You may end up having to go to appeal, although there's not that many appeals happening right now, actually. If the placement, if you feel your child is identified under the wrong category, then that may be worth fighting for. If you really feel strongly about the placement, then yeah, that might be worth it. But if it's more what they're doing with your child, that's the kind of thing you have to negotiate really, and that's what we're going to be talking about more. Okay, how are we doing? Yeah, we're okay. So this is where I was going to stop for a minute. Is there any other things about IPRCs that I have a question? Yes.
I just want to say something.
Sure.
I guess it applies to everybody. I'm a social education teacher, and I was identified in grade 4 with learning disability. I have my master's now, so it's okay. Yeah. So it's gonna be okay. But my mom was a very strong advocate for me. Otherwise, I would not be here, and I would not have done half of what I've done. But the important thing, I just want to say this because I didn't know if I'd have time at the end. I wanted to say, one, I'm a special education teacher, and I really love advocating for basically most of the people in this room. I love going in up against teachers because I'm a teacher, and I know what they're supposed to get, so don't try, okay? I know teachers are busy too, because I'm a teacher and I know that, but yeah, I've been through it on both ends, and the important part is I can feel the frustration levels in here, I can feel the anxiety, and I just wanted to say you're doing a really great job, and if there's anything I can do to help you, I've been through all of this myself. In grade 4 I couldn't read, and they were like, oh crap. My mom advocated for me, then I became a self-advocate. There are multiple things that are available to you, all the way up through university, through graduate school, and then I started a PhD. So, and I couldn't read in grade 4. You really should be reading in grade 4. So, if there's anything I can do.
And don't give up, right?
And don't give up, yeah, because they'll become self-advocates, and that means a lot. In university, I already knew. I went right away to the academic support, and I was like, I know there's stuff here. You need to do this, this, and this, because I want this, this, and this. And it was done. They didn't say a word, so. All you moms and dads, you're doing a good job. Yeah, thank you. You're welcome.
I have one question. In order for a child to have an IPRC, do they have to be in grade 3? Like, do they have an IEP until grade 3? No? Okay.
No, that is maybe the standard approach a board may have. And it depends on the exceptionality too. So kids, say, who are coming in with autism, for example, are already identified. Then it's pretty clear they could be getting an IPRC in kindergarten. The earlier a child gets intervention, the better. Yeah. And because if they don't get help early, then they're just going to get frustrated, poor self-esteem, turned off.
But they don't have to be older than 8 years old.
No, mine was
We're
identified.
going to take 2 more questions.
Well, that's my question, is what kind of documentation is needed to initiate that IPRC stuff? I've got documents in from a physician who does cognitive educational evaluations showing my child has problems with written output and executive functioning. And I was told, oh, just your summary letter should go in the OSR. We don't need the doctor's report.
Sometimes you need, like there will be a board psychologist. Sometimes you can take the information you have and talk to a board psychologist and see what, and if there may be more testing needed. If it's a family doc, if it's a medical doctor and there isn't a full psychological or psychoeducational assessment, there might need to be more, and you might need to look into more, but technically...
So it's the psychoeducational assessment that generally is what...
Well, for learning disabilities, under the learning disability category, not for all categories,
right.
but under learning
disability. And if the
disability.
school is saying we've allocated our 3...
Yeah, we've,
what do I do?
You can provide those, but you have the money.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
1,500.
Well, and there really shouldn't be, I mean, People for Education did a whole survey a year or so ago about school boards having a certain number of psych assessments that they're allowed, and that really should not be a
I have a
policy.
teacher and an EA telling me, oh, have you thought about a psycho evaluation? Yeah, I thought about it, but why aren't you bringing it forward?
That's a good.
And those are very common, unfortunately, your issues.
I'll just, as a parent, I can recommend that
Yeah.
if you have the means to get your child a private psych eval, and by any chance you have some type of extra medical coverage where you can get that, I highly recommend it, because even though your child, maybe my child was in line waiting for their psych eval, it was a 2-year wait, and there wasn't a number, but there are limited number of resources, right? So there's limited number of psychologists, etc. We're fortunate that our medical coverage covered a portion of it, my husband and I. So my thoughts were, I'm going to free up that psychologist to give that evaluation to someone else who doesn't have the additional means. And you can get it more quickly, more thoroughly, and that's your tool. It's a tool, strictly a tool. It doesn't label your child, but it allows others the opportunity to perhaps look for those.
More information about your child.
Right. Talk all about how your child.
I would also suggest, and again, we're going to have to go on because we won't have time to talk about
One
the
more
other.
question.
But I just want to say that our local associations usually know what the options are, our local learning disabilities associations. So our website is at the back of the handout. You can find your local chapter, and they will know if there's any sliding scale clinics and places like that you can get an assessment. So, yes.
I just wanted to say that it's not uncommon to hear, oh, we don't do IPRCs in kindergarten, even when you go in with an autism diagnosis.
Yeah.
Oh, no, we're just going to see how he does.
Right.
Okay, but if you don't know, again, you don't have the ability to advocate and say, well, actually, no, that doesn't actually make sense according to the ministry guidelines. But I also wanted to mention that it's only been since 2010 that I'm in the TDSB. My kids are both, one is in an alternative school, and I had to choose to not have her identified in order to get her into the school, because up until 2010, you couldn't register in an alternative or a French immersion school in the TDSB if you had an identification.
Right, so and that's a board
Because
policy.
they refused to offer any spec ed support to their specialty schools.
Yeah, okay, and that's a board policy, not a ministry policy. So and that's something that issues like that are policies should go to SEAC, the Special Education Advisory Committee, and they should be dealing with that.
It's been changed.
Yeah, good.
Yes, somebody decided to
Pursue
correct
it.
the lawsuit.
Okay, we're going to those questions to the end.
Okay, so IEPs. So first of all, to review IPRC every year. If you can possibly go, even though they'll say you don't really have to come. The IEP, they have to do an IEP if you have an IPRC, and they can do it if you don't have an IPRC. The review IPRC is important to know that you can ask for one if you want something changed 3 months into the program. So 3 months after whatever special ed program starts, not including the summer. You can ask for one. If something's changed, for example, so like say you've got a new assessment and there's more, maybe the exceptionality needs to change. You don't have to wait for the one that comes in here. The IEP, I think you all know what it is. I think the important thing is to distinguish between accommodations and modifications. Next one, please. Okay? So the key thing is that accommodations don't change what your child learns. Just how they learn, how it's presented, how they show what they learn. And here are some examples of that. So it means that they could be working on grade level curriculum with accommodations. Okay, so assistive technologies are specific kinds of accommodations that are available to help students work on the curriculum. Okay, so the difference with modifications is that they do change the level. And it can actually be up. So for gifted kids, they can be working on grade level expectations that are higher than the grade that they're in for their age. For kids who have intellectual disabilities, they are likely going to be working at a lower grade level expectations. For students with learning disabilities and some other kinds of exceptionalities, they may be doing both. So they may have some of their program modified and other parts not. So in the lower grades, when they're really working on skills, reading, writing skills, they may be modified because they're working on lower level skills because they haven't mastered them yet. When they get to the higher grade levels, and it's important that they be, and they understand the material, it's important that they be working at grade level curriculum with the accommodations. So for students with learning disabilities, for example, that may mean that they are, they use assistive technology to hear things read to them. They may use voice dictation or at least typing or keyboarding on a computer to write things. But it's the same novels, it's the same textbooks that they're reading because they understand it, they just can't read it. Okay? They may still be working on some of those reading and writing skills at the same time. And so there might be a little bit of their program that's modified. And then the other areas are alternative skill areas, and those are things that are not part of the curriculum at all. So you can't say that it's really grade 2 curriculum that they're working on. So here are some examples. So anger management, social skills, organizational skills can be specifically taught, and if they're taught to the student and not to the whole class, then they can actually be alternative skill areas. They go on the IEP, and you have goals and expectations for them, and you check and see what you're doing to reach those goals. And again, in high school, courses that do not count as credits would be called alternative skill areas. So, okay, next. Okay.
You could ask for alternative skill in your IEP for your high school age child.
Yes.
Really?
But just be aware that if you won't get an Ontario secondary school diploma if it's K credits.
No, in addition to.
Yeah, so there's a difference. If it's an alternative skill instead of curriculum, or alternative skill in addition, and that's a very
that
important.
Has to be made clear.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's also, you have to be aware that if everything is modified right after grade 8, then your options for high school are limited.
Right.
So that's when you really have to start paying attention in the intermediate grades. How much is modified? How much is accommodated? Are they actually doing the curriculum? Now, it depends on how much is reasonable, is expected. Yes.
Can I just ask you a quick question on the removal of a modification? So if there's a modification, for example, quickly, my daughter had a modification in numeration only, one grade level below her existing grade, and then all of a sudden in September it disappeared. I said, where's the modification? Well, her teacher doesn't feel she needs one. So is that the way it's done?
Well, does it mean that she's working out on grade level
and
curriculum?
they feel that she's successfully working at grade level, and I'm not opposed to that. I'm fine with that. My question was just, was it just done like that?
Well, that raises the issue of the IEP, because if something's changed in the IEP, then that's supposed to be done in consultation. So it shouldn't be a surprise.
Well, I mean, they considered consultation because they handed me the new IEP. I was the one who noted that the modification.
Okay, well, and that brings up this whole issue, and I'm glad you raised that, because that's an important issue about what does consultation on an IEP mean?
Right.
And it's, as much as there's a lot written in policy from the ministry about that parents are supposed to be consulted, and ideally that it's a team and that you get together and create it and you put your ideas in. I've certainly heard of lots of situations where parents are handed one. Hopefully it says draft, at least, and you can make suggestions. If you're handed one and asked to sign it, that is not consultation, and that is not. And now, last year was a little bit different, to be fair, because of the disruption with the teachers. So things didn't always happen the way they would happen normally, I have to say. But given that that's not going on this year, there should be a consultation period before. And I'll get back to you, okay? The other thing is, though, there is no requirement that you agree with the IEP. You have to sign that you've seen it, but you don't have to sign that you agree with it. That's different than the IPRC. When you sign the IPRC, it means you agree. If you sign the IEP, it means you've seen it. There is supposed to be a place on there for comments. The ministry electronic model that they use doesn't have a space for parent comments on it. So we keep reminding them about that, and they haven't revised it yet. But you should, if there's something that you're not happy with, make sure, add an extra page if you need to, and have your comments on. Yeah, or scribble on. Yeah, okay. But there's no appeal of an IEP, and there's no appeal of implementation. Yes.
So I'd just like to comment on that. The lady there said she'd write on the IEP, but we have to remember it's an electronic form, so that the written part won't stay there. It will get duplicated.
On an electronic form, there's a real problem with
Right.
the electronic forms. We're hearing, there's electronic forms that have drop-down menus, and the better ones of those have other, so you can at least add things in. There are some that don't even have that around the province, so that, if your kids' needs don't happen to fit in the drop-down menu, that's too bad. So I know it's more efficient, but it's not ideal.
Can you request though that your scribbled on copy be put in the OSR so that it's counted as a form of document?
Yeah, I guess you could. Yeah. And there's all these ways around, that may not be ideal, but okay. Okay, so this is what I call the rubber hits the road, because making the IEP work is negotiation. Okay? It's really understanding and getting it. So if the educators get it, they understand, then it's going to happen, as within reason. Within their time frame. If they really don't get it, you can shove it in their face, you can yell and say you have to do this, but it's not going to happen, in my experience. So it's difficult. And you do have to be firm, you have to be persistent, and acknowledging that the teacher has a lot to do is really important, to try to see it from their perspective, that they've got all these kids in the class, and you realize that you're asking them to go above and beyond, but you really feel that this is important because this is what your child needs.
And fun people like me. And fun people like me.
Yeah. Right. We could try cloning you, but I don't think we can do that. Okay. When you don't agree, you start with the teacher, then you bring more and more people in, okay? And the lowest level that you can work it out, the better, because it's the teacher that's going to actually have to do it, the classroom teacher or the special ed teacher. So, maybe bring the classroom teacher and the special ed teacher, and then the resource teacher. Sometimes I say, the psychologist that did the assessment, or the social worker that's working with your child, maybe they can have some input. You shouldn't need to have a professional, you know your child as a parent, but it can help sometimes to have that. So a meeting, I'm a big fan of problem-solving case conference meetings that are informal. These are not IPRCs. This is going in and saying, things are not working, what can we put our heads together to do to figure out something that's going to work? You again, start at the school level, but you might have to bring the superintendent of special ed in, you might have to bring the psychologist, school psychologist who did the assessment, or who interpreted the assessment in. At the end, writing a note is important for two reasons. One, you need to summarize what you understood and clarify with them that that's what they understood, because you may come away with a completely different idea than what they came up with. So getting that clarified, and then asking for, okay, how are we going to follow up on this and make sure it happens? Sometimes you have to go higher. So it could be an area superintendent or a special education coordinator. And again, let the principal or the teacher know that you're doing that, and then bring them in. Some superintendents or coordinators have been trained in mediation and facilitation and can actually help work out things. It can be, but if you just go and talk to them and don't involve the school, then you're going to alienate people at the school. Sometimes there are other dispute resolution processes. You can ask, does your board have a dispute resolution process? What is it? Who do I contact? There might be somebody in the board who's responsible for that. Call your parent association or whatever exceptionality you are. Consider finding an advocate. They're hard to find. And sometimes you can talk to your regional office. You know, the regional office are Board of Education people who relate directly to school boards. So they would have 4 or 5 school boards underneath that they're responsible for and who report to them. Quite often they don't see it in their role to interfere, but they may give you some perspective. So, okay, to end, meeting the special education needs of your child is our goal, and sometimes we lose track of that. Everybody loses track of that because you're just so caught up in conflict, and just stopping and reminding people that that's the goal can help. Okay, now we can have questions.
Okay, yes. The question and answers, and I'm just going to point to you, so when I point, we have the things.
Okay, just want to say what all that Daniela says, wonderful input there, thank you, that is true. I also wanted to touch on something you mentioned about if a child has an IEP up to, I think it says, past the grade 8 level or something along that line. I kind of lost what you had said there, but what I wanted to say on that, like I have a son that's been identified even before, I mean, I guess he wasn't identified in kindergarten but he was seriously speech impaired, and he has always been in a modified class, and I, through advocating, and that is the key from beginning to end, finally decided to take him out of the modified class that he's in, because I see his potential.
Was it a smaller class?
It was a smaller class,
okay.
and now he's in grade 11, and grade 11 is where I said, okay, IPRC is still there, but I want him in a mainline, because as a parent, as much as I've always been even volunteering in the school system, gone through the school system, I didn't realize that my child was going to leave school with a certificate as opposed to an high school diploma. And when I found that out, I said, no way. I want my child to leave school with an high school diploma. I don't care if it takes him 2 more years. He's still very young. And it was grade 11 this year that I started advocating for it. And I got him out. He had the entire thing with the psychologist, what have you. They said he's functioning at a grade 4 level. He's now in grade 11. However, I've taken him out, put him in a regular applied class. The child is getting, in his class, 68, 97, and what have you. So I know, and I had to fight for that. And like some parents would have walked away, I said, this is my child. I know his potential. I know what he's capable of doing. Nobody says no to me, so if he goes and he fails, then that's fine. I'm not going to limit him. The child is doing quite well.
Okay,
and after all that review.
It's very important to strive for, keep your goals high. Consult with professionals to get their opinion, of course, on what's realistic. But yeah, okay. and that's why I was mentioning it's important to look at how much is modified in elementary school, because that means are you going to be able to go into applied, or can you only go into locally developed courses, which may or may not be for credit. I mean, there are some locally developed courses that are sort of bridging courses that you can take that will lead you into doing applied level courses. That's fine. But yeah, be aware. That's the main thing. And again, don't assume that everything is going to go smoothly. You have to really inform yourself. Yes.
I was an advocate, a hand holder for a parent of our board. And the principal, and she was wondering why only English was being modified. And you had said something that triggered something, so I just want to know if it's true. As long as they're teaching 75% of the curriculum, they don't have to put it on the IEP as modified.
Okay, so you're talking, there's two different things. There's what is called modified on the report card,
Yes.
and what is on the IEP. Okay, so if the course is not modified, then you don't have to fill out the program section. You don't have to have goals and
On the IEP.
on the IEP. Yeah.
Right. But he had said that he's not going to get, she was not going to get the whole course, just 75% of it, and we don't have to put that on the IEP. And we're choosing not to.
So they're not doing it on the IEP. Okay.
I mean, a couple, one of the many meetings that I go to.
The problem with that is then you don't get any of the curriculum goals set, and you don't have the annual goals set.
So could she have pushed for that? For
I
her
would
daughter?
say,
And said, well, if it's 75%, then I'm insisting that you put it.
I am not aware of any ministry policy on that. I think that would be something one would have to look. Find out what the policy is. One of the things I often say to parents is, if they tell you there's a policy, ask to see it in writing.
Oh,
Okay? Because there's informal policies that are written policies. Okay.
My question is regarding modifications, accommodations, what that means to me as a newbie to this whole area. I've studied up on it quite a bit, but what can I expect, and is it sort of ministry-wide, or is it school board driven in terms of therapeutic approach to learning disability? In other words, executive function, for example, proprioceptive skills. Are they worked on, or are they worked around, and do I have to supplement myself as a parent?
Well, there's two answers to that. I guess some of those things could come in as alternative skills if they're not actually part of the curriculum. Do parents of children with learning disabilities have to supplement? In a lot of cases, yes. If you can, it shouldn't have to be, but many parents do choose to. Yeah.
Just one moment, because you just addressed, I'm asking the question, but address the issue as to what avenues do the child have if they take modified classes versus accommodated classes in post-secondary.
To post-secondary or secondary?
Post-secondary.
Well, if they're all, in high school, the principal can decide how much is modified before it's called a credit, and that's the principal's decision. And if they don't get credits, then they're not going to get post-secondary, basically. You have to have all your credits to get to post-secondary, so if it's modified too much, then you're not going to get credits. Okay?
And that's the point. The credits are the most important.
Is there information available in French?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I don't know about your stuff, but there's lots. My children go to French school. There's lots in French.
We are going to be having a website available to educators. It's going to be in French and English. LDA of Canada is bilingual, and they have information in French. We have a little bit in French, but not.
And the ministry website has it.
And the ministry website has, you can just look it up on French.
The lady over there, did you?
Yeah, I just,
Oh, no.
Not the other lady.
my friend's daughter is hearing impaired, she'll be starting a mainstream school in 2 years. But I understand, will there be a gap between, the first day in September when she starts and having the FM system installed and usable?
You talking about kindergarten?
Kindergarten, early kindergarten.
There is supposed to be a process for kids going into full-day kindergarten who come in with the identified needs already, not IPRC identified, but identified outside. Ideally, that is supposed to happen. I would suggest talking to, or your friend talking to Voice for Hearing Impaired Children, who would know how that works in different boards. Voice does have representatives on special education advisory committees, so they would know. A lot of these things vary a lot from board to board. And, the ministry sets policy, but how it's actually implemented is really up to your school board, so you need to know how it works in your board.
Okay, time for 2 quick questions.
This gentleman has a...
Yeah, yes,
I think it's really important when you're looking at the elementary level to look at what is being done around second language courses and the support that's being available there, because a lot of the time when English language students get to grade 9, they get exempted from French because they haven't been sufficiently supported through elementary school to be able to develop the skills to successfully complete a French course. Whether they start in kindergarten in some boards or they start in grade 4 in other boards, they just don't have the skills to be able to be successful, so they just exempt them outright rather than support them from the beginning. I imagine it's probably not much different for supporting English language development in French primary schools. So when you're in your IEP meetings, really make sure, does the French teacher know that this kid has been IPRC? Because sometimes the French teacher is completely kept out of the loop.
That's something that people decide one way or the other. Some people don't want it because they have a language-based disability, but whichever side you're on, you need to know. You need to know, absolutely. Yes, Caroline.
Actually, that sort of calls the theme that I was planning. Because I'm actually from Canadian Parents for French, Ontario, and one of the things we often hear now, especially with is conflicts that are arising because while French immersion is increasing popularity, there's a lack of support in special ed, and a lot of people are being counseled out. And we have, on the other hand, we have these tons of stories of people who have managed to get their kids through, even with special ed needs, through the French education. Basically, Herculean efforts to get there. Even one of our board members, her daughter has special ed needs, and now her daughter's in the bilingual program at UT. And so, but she basically had to fight every level in order to get them to stay in. And there should be some more support on this.
Right. And it's an individual thing. I mean, you can't just sort of make a blanket policy. All kids who have special education needs shouldn't be in French immersion.
The problem is the attitude, though. I guess it's just a sense that, the kid, because they're having some problems in one area, and there's lots of research to support the idea that you can speak a language, any language, you can speak a second language just as well, and more, even they're finding even Down syndrome children can be bilingual or, trilingual, but there has to be support and belief in that.
I'm with the Ottawa Toronto District School Board. I'm a trustee there, have been for years, and have been a special education advocate for many years before that. And we certainly saw that trend in our board. We did a very comprehensive second language study, French as a second language study, and there was resounding evidence of the actual benefits to children with special needs of having access to that second language
and music
opportunities. And again, there is a certain amount of choice. The biggest obstacle is we now, as a board, have adopted a policy where students won't be pushed out, and that we will provide resources. But the challenge is having those resources available. Sometimes to find the resources available in French. However, there is also evidence to support that even getting some of that support in English is better than some kids who are just not getting the support at all. If you're in French immersion, you don't get any support.
The last question?
Oh, it's just a comment on that. Our board, they won't take them out of French at all in elementary school. And so my
You mean
son
out of
just-
core French?
Yeah. So he's dyslexic, and I don't have a problem with him being in the French, that's fine, as long as he doesn't have to try to read or write the French, because that will just confuse what he learns to do in English.
And that's why I'm saying it's an individual thing. You have to look at the strengths as well as the difficulties of each individual child and make an individual decision and not just do it on philosophy.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.